12 o'clock, we'll get started. If stragglers come in, so be it. We are kind of done, of course, with the chronological study of Suwannee County's history. So now we're looking at various topics, and last month we started looking at individual communities. So last time was Live Oak, today is Branford, and what is now called Branford. So we're going to be looking in that part of the county, so the focus will be just in that area. Early history is the same as the rest of the county, things like some of these early Weed Island culture and things like that, the Native Americans that lived here starting way back when. Here are some of their relics that are left that have been discovered. I think this is actually in Columbia County, but close enough. But this is what they left behind. No written language, nothing like that. So what we learn of them, we learn from digging up their relics, their artifacts. By the time the Europeans arrived, of course, we've talked about these guys before, the Timucua or Timucua, depending on who you are. But this Native American group lived in this region from down towards Ocala all the way up to the Altamaha River, up in the Carolinas and Georgia, all up there. But this area was the land of the Timucua, which was not what they called themselves. It's what their enemies on the coast called them. When the Europeans arrived, they asked who lives in the interior, and they said Themagona, which is my enemy, and they took Themagona and eventually became Timucua or Timucua as the years progressed. But these hunter-gatherers, but also farmers, and we've talked about these guys before. I talked about them last month. Heavily tattooed. The older you got, the more things you did, the more tattoos you got. They were very tall compared to the Europeans that arrived. They pulled their hair up to make them appear even taller. Hunter-gatherers, yes, they fished, they hunted, but they also were an agrarian society that could farm, do farmland and stuff. So we see that throughout the area. So when the Europeans arrived into what's now Suwannee County in the 1500s, 1520s with Narvaez, and the 1530s with Hernando de Soto, they came through this area after Spain had declared Florida to be theirs. But it took about 60 or 70 more years before the Spaniards really started coming into the interior of Florida. And they did that by establishing mission sites. So you can see all these brown dots are mission sites that were established by the Spanish in the 1500s, the 1600s, and a few of them perhaps even all the way up into the early 1700s. But you can see pretty much these are the roads, the Camino Real, the high road, low road type stuff. And Suwannee County, you can see several right there around the Branford area. So they established these. Some of them we've looked at in the past. Santa Cruz de Tarajica. It started off in what's now Columbia County, and then it moved to somewhere in Suwannee County, maybe Little River Springs area, so just upriver from Branford. But it moved there by the end of the 1656 Timucua Rebellion, and it was abandoned in 1691. So that's one of those that were somewhere around Branford that we know of. Let's see. This picture and the next few pictures are ones I took probably 15 years ago over at Mission San Luis de Apalache in Tallahassee. And it shows what looks like the post-Timucuan Rebellion of 1656, where they moved them after the rebellion, because you can see they're pretty much almost all of them on the Royal Road, which the Spaniards moved them there after that rebellion to make it easier to access, to send troops and such. So this appears to be the post-rebellion location of the mission sites. They just moved a lot of them. But you can see several there in Suwannee County. We also had San Martin de Ayucura, which was also located in Columbia County, just across the Ichetucknee River, so close to Suwannee County. It was abandoned in the mid-1660s, and then they moved over a few miles to Suwannee County, somewhere on this side of the Ichetucknee River. And they renamed it Santa Catalina de Afusia, and it was destroyed in 1685 by the English. They came in and they raided, and they also had some of their Yamasee Indian allies. They basically came in and they attacked because the European powers were fighting, as they tended to do, especially back then. And we see the English against the Spaniards, against the French, everybody fighting against each other. So the English came in several times into Florida in the late 1600s and also in the 1700s and raided these Spanish mission sites. So the reports from the 1685 destruction talked about the Franciscan mission chapel, and the houses were burned, 50 of the Timucuan converts were killed, and then 220 other Timucuans were taken as slaves by the English. So it pretty much wiped out that mission at that point, but then it was rebuilt, but it only stuck around for another few more years before it was abandoned, and the survivors were dispersed throughout some of the other mission sites. A lot of them. Now this is from, again, Tallahassee. This was a large mission site. The ones in Suwannee County were not this nice. Not near as nice. Another picture from Tallahassee. Another one was San Agustin de Urijica, different ways of spelling it, but this one was disappeared after that rebellion of 1656, and it was replaced by one called San Agustin de Ojoica, and it could have been either around Branford, Beachville, or even O'Brien. So we're not even sure exactly where that one was, but it would have been somewhere south part of the county, somewhere close to Branford, if not Branford itself. But it was abandoned in 1675, so it didn't even last about 20 years after that rebellion of 1656. And these mission sites and a lot of the other ones in the interior especially became either abandoned as the Native Americans were killed by disease, by warfare, or destroyed by the Europeans, the English especially, destroying a lot of them. All the way up through the early 1700s, pretty much what was left in Suwannee County of our mission sites were wiped out in the first years of the 1700s. This one I believe was 1705 or 1710. It was destroyed. Basically, the Spanish got wind of it, and they left one direction as the English were coming in the other direction to destroy it. So it's a close thing. But these mission sites in the interior of Florida were destroyed. And so from that point on, there really wasn't much left in Suwannee County and in the surrounding counties. Even the Timucua were dying off, and there weren't that many left. The English took over, the British by that point. The British had taken over Florida after the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian Wars, we call it, at the end of that in 1763. So Florida became English territory or British territory, and the few surviving Timucua Indians left with the Spaniards to go to Cuba, most of them. And the last known Timucuan died in 1767 there in Cuba. There's the possibility that some of them survived in the wild here and perhaps intermingled with the Seminole Indians that came to be this area. We don't know for sure, but there's been reports of it. Well, the British only had Florida for 20 years. And then the end of the American Revolution in 1783, which was a global war. It was not just here in the colonies. We became like a minor part of that war. But when Britain and France and the other powers, the United States, established that peace treaty, the Treaty of Paris, one of the treaties of Paris, the English gave back Florida to Spain, who was too poor to really do much about it. So Spain basically opened up the borders to allow these new American settlers to come in, and also whoever else pretty much wanted to come in. They pretty much just had to convert to Catholicism, and then it was carte blanche for the rest of it. So that lasted for about 20, 30 years. More and more settlers were moving in. Well, by this point, they are coming in contact with the Seminole Indians that were now living in North Florida. And that turns into several skirmishes, massacres. And so eventually in 1818, General Andrew Jackson comes into Florida with a small army, and he starts wiping out the Seminole Indian villages that are in North Florida. It starts over to Apalachicola, starts working his way eastward, all the way up to the Suwannee River, destroys the villages that he finds, not finding too many Indians because they have fled as soon as they find out he's on the way. And he also destroys the Negro towns, as they're called, from the former slaves that have escaped. He destroys their towns. Then he goes back home. Well, that kind of leads to the transfer, or helps expedite anyway, the transfer of Florida from Spain, who couldn't defend it, the transfer to the United States of America. So in 1819, finalized in 1821, Florida becomes a territory of the United States of America. The Seminoles pretty much are the only ones still living pretty much in this area. Our first white settlers are moving in, people like Reuben and Rebecca Charles, who move into the Charles Ferry or Charles Springs area in the early 1820s. But by and large, it's still Seminole Indians that live in this area. As Florida is now a territory, it's divided up into East and West Florida. The dividing line is the Suwannee River. And as the politicians are looking, they are trying to determine where the new capital for this new territory is going to be located. Because for a century, there were two capitals. The one of East Florida, which was St. Augustine, and then there was West Florida, which was Pensacola. And what they started doing, the early politicians, even American ones, would have to travel. Like 6 months out of the year, it was one location. The other 6 months, it was the other. But these are on opposite ends of the state. And so they wanted to try to find one central location. And so after Florida became a territory, they very seriously considered putting the state capital, or the territorial capital at the time, where the Suwannee and the Santa Fe meet, just downriver from Branford. They actually send scouts to come down and look. Well, it's flood stage apparently at that point, and they realize maybe it's not the best place to put a capital where it's flooding, where these two rivers are coming together. And so they decide, of course, on an abandoned Indian village called Tallahassee instead. So that becomes the territorial and later the state capital. So we still have the Seminole Indians as the 1820s go in the 1830s. We've got more massacres, more skirmishes. Eventually, in the mid-1830s, the Second Seminole War starts, and that war lasts until 1842, at which point all the Seminoles in this part of the country, this part of the state or territory, are either sent down south, they flee down south, or they are sent over to what's now Oklahoma in that territory. And so North Florida, North and Central Florida are pretty much depopulated of the Seminole Indians, and they're replaced by more and more Americans who have moved in. And it's during this war that we've got the first steamboats that travel on the Suwannee River. So they would be passing what is now the location of Branford on their way upriver. The first one we know of was in 1836, called the Minerva. There might have been ones earlier than that. We don't have any record of it. So the Minerva went up and down river. Supposedly at Suwannee Springs, there was a fort or a garrison anyway during the Second Seminole War, and she was sent upriver there during flooding because they were cut off otherwise from food sources. And so supposedly 1836, 1837, she brought food and supplies to Suwannee Springs on the north end of the county. There was also a boat called the Izzard, which was owned by the federal government, or at least loaned to the federal government, and she was lost at the mouth of the Withlacoochee. From what I'm reading, I think it's the one that goes in the Suwannee River, not the one in Central Florida, because she'd been on the Suwannee River before that, so it makes sense. So pretty much somewhere around where the state park is today, Suwannee River State Park, is where that boat was lost in around 1837 or so. The war ends, again, the Seminoles are out, more settlers are moving in. By 1845, they are talking about bringing mail into what's now Suwannee County. It was still, at this point, it's part of Columbia. But in the mid-1840s, more people are moving here and they want better mail service. They don't have to go to Lake City or what would become Lake City. They want something closer. And so in 1845, the steamboat Orpheus begins delivering mail to Columbus, which is where the Suwannee River State Park is now. And then she'd go down to Cedar Key, be transferring back and forth the mail and supplies and stuff. She only serves a couple of years before she's lost at the mouth of the Suwannee. And so that's the end of that steamboat. That's Osceola, in case y'all didn't know. All right, so before Branford, or before the community that is called Branford, there was one very close by called New Boston. You can see it on the maps here and here. Branford is basically here. So it was within a few miles of modern day Branford. The earliest records I can find with New Boston being mentioned is 1857. It's usually called New Boston. Sometimes it's just called Boston. But by then it had a post office. So odds are somebody had been living there already for at least a couple of years. So the New Boston post office, established in 1857. It was connected on several roads. One of them went to Little River to the north, and then McIntosh Courthouse, which later became New Troy, down here, aka New Troy, to the south. Also to Tuckney and Collins, which were to the east. So the first postmaster was Noble Hull. Noble Hull, I've talked about before. He became our first sheriff when we became a county in 1858. He also became lieutenant governor of Florida for a little while. But he was the first postmaster of New Boston. He was appointed on December 29th, 1857. That's my birthday, not the year. But he became the first postmaster of New Boston. That same month, there are advertisements for a steamboat named the Colonel Cottrell, which is owned by James Tucker, Captain James Tucker, who we've talked about before also. But he was traveling between New Boston and places further downriver to deliver passengers and mail service. So obviously there was a steamboat stop there at New Boston by 1859, which again indicates it had been there for a few years before that. Let's see. Yeah, 1859, December, Florida legislature authorized what's called the Lake City and Suwannee Railroad Company. And it was supposed to go from Lake City down to New Boston. So apparently there were enough people there that, hey, we should put a railroad down to that point. Sounds like a good thing. Nothing was done with it that I found, probably because the next year or two the Civil War started. So they just didn't get funding, or it went by the wayside, as a lot of these railroads that I've talked about before do. But New Boston was a community. In 1860, this guy here, named Daniel W. Tedder, became postmaster. Got a few records of him. He would move to Live Oak later on, where this photograph was taken circa 1900, become very prominent up here. He was businessman, politician, those kinds of things. But he was postmaster in 1860. The New Boston post office was unestablished, or closed, if you will, in 1867, but there were still enough people there 2 years later that when the county was looking to move the county seat from Houston to Live Oak or to some other place, there were 6 polling places. And Live Oak was one, Houston, which was the county seat at that time, Welborn, Columbus, Plowdens, and then New Boston. That was the 6th election site. So obviously there were a lot of people in that area, or at least close enough to get there to vote. And in that election, Live Oak became the winner. Suwannee County had been established in 1858. We've talked about that before. Other than the New Boston area, it looks like most of Branford, what's now Branford, was still kind of not a lot of people living there. Flipping through. 1861, Florida secedes from the Union. This is the original Ordinance of Secession, which is over in Tallahassee. And I believe I've talked about this before, but you can see here where the paper is gone and it's been handwritten. That's where they glued the paper to wood, hoping to preserve it. And the glue is eating away at it, and the acid in the wood is eating away at it. So eventually this document is going to go bye-bye. But James Newman from Suwannee County signed that. And so we went to war. 15% of our male adult population went off to serve, about 250 guys, which was more than the average. And most of them came back. So just have to mention Civil War in passing because it involves Captain Tucker again, and we've talked about him also before. Seems like I'm sometimes beating a dead horse when I talk about some of these people over and over again. But Captain Tucker sailed several steamboats up and down river, the Colonel Cottrell I just talked about a few minutes ago. But also, he's more famously known to be the owner of the steamboat Madison, which was built in the 1850s. Up and down river, it was a floating post office, a floating general store, and it would go all the way up to Suwannee Springs or beyond, White Springs occasionally, if it was at flood stage. So he would go up and down river. He would often, of course, because of the way the river is, he would stay downriver most of the time, so around what's now Branford in that area and further south. But he would come up to Columbus a lot. But when the war began, this was put in service, the ship was put in service as a gunboat, makeshift gunboat, basically put a gun on it, put some soldiers on it and sailors, and go out and protect the Suwannee River. And that's what she did for a couple of years, even capturing or recapturing several ships that had been captured by the Union during that time period. 1863, Captain Tucker and his men are ordered to go north to help the Army of Northern Virginia with General Lee. And so the steamboat Madison is scuttled in Troy Springs, not too far upriver from Branford. By war's end, she has been stripped of everything above the water. All of her upper works are gone. Her metal, the funnels, the engines are gone to be used for other things. And so Captain Tucker never comes back to reclaim the boat and put her back into service. So her remains are still there even today. So it took a few years after the war ended for steamboats to come back onto the Suwannee River. The first one that we know of was the Wawanock that started back in 1872. And again, these steamboats would have been traveling right past Branford, or what would become Branford. They'd go up to New Boston, they'd go up to New Troy, Boston, New Boston, all the way up to Columbus sometimes. Let's see. She only lasted a couple of years, then she went over to New Orleans. David Yulee was the one that replaced her. That's the remains of the David Yulee back in 1958, where she sank close to the mouth of the Suwannee River. Also, the two-decker named the Erie started in 1880, up and down river for a few years. Caddo Bell was another one. Bertha Lee, I've talked about these, I believe, before. And I think later on in the presentation series, I'll go into more detail about these steamboats. But I'm just mentioning them in passing, because they would have passed by what's now Branford. But let's get into Branford itself. All right. Branford. It was established by 1880, not as Branford, but as Roland's Bluff, or Roland. Here's how it's spelled in 1886, which is the earliest map I can find with it showing. It was there by 1880, being discussed as Roland's Bluff, because here it is in 1880 with a ferry crossing. And there, very likely there was a ferry crossing before that. Going through articles, going through records, there was a 1931 write-up that I've got a copy of that was from the town of Branford, talking about its history. And it talks about, quote, Branford was originally known as Roland's Bluff at a time when only one small cabin located on the banks of the Suwannee near the Twin Springs, surrounded with many great trees, constituted the residential section. It's what we know as Branford Springs today. Pretty much there was one house, and it was called Roland's Bluff. J.C. Powell, who wrote the book American Siberia, 400-page book about the convict labor, the lease system. Very good book. He talks about it, and he says, quote, it was a little river station named after an old settler named Mr. Rawlins. There's different kinds of spellings. R-O-W-L-A-N-D, R-O-L-L-A-N-D, R-O-L-I-N, R-O-L-L-I-N, lots of different spellings. In looking at our records, and I checked back this morning to look, I did find where there was a Mary Ann Rawland, the widow, who sold property in what's now Branford, the section township and range of Branford today. She sold property in 1859 to some other folks. There was also a William Rowland, who could have been her husband or a son, that he owned property in that area too. So I've got to do some more digging to see which Rowland, but Mary Ann Rowland at least was the widow of the man who named Roland's Bluff. So I guess that's where their house was, close to the springs. Unfortunately, to see exactly when they got that property is probably going to be impossible, because before that we were part of Columbia County, and they don't have records that far back. They were burned up in about 4 different fires. Earliest they go back to the 1870s. So I may never find out exactly when Mr. Rowland, or his first name even, got the property. But we know by 1859 there was a Mary Ann Rawlins that was the widow that lived there on that bluff, and that she owned hundreds of acres right there. So pretty much that was when it was established that we know of. In 1878, there was a guy by the name of N.H. Bishop, and he wrote a book called The Voyage of the Paper Canoe. Basically, he built a canoe, and he goes into a big description of it in the book of how he made it out of basically paper. It was literally a paper canoe. And he sailed it from way up north all the way down and ended at the mouth of the Suwannee River. And so he talks about passing this area, and lots of good stuff in that book about this area, but he talks about sailing past Roland's Bluff, which he called an uninhabited elevation that had recently been proposed for a railroad. So that was 1878. So at that point, nobody lived there. Ms. Rollins had already sold the property, and it was pretty much just abandoned. But then by 1880, it becomes the site of a ferry crossing. And this ferry crossing is set up by a family we're going to talk about in a few more minutes, but it's by J.A. Ivy and Brothers. It's going to be part of the Ivy family. And J.A. Ivy is one of, I believe that's Jess, is one of several Ivy brothers that go into business together. Their dad was a minister, and they lived in the Lurville, Branford area, or what will become Branford, and owned a lot of property down there. Went into sawmills, went into lots of different things. But J. Ivy and Brothers. So they established a ferry at Branford, at the time called Roland's Bluff, in 1880. So that goes back to some stuff. A couple years later, that railroad that was alluded to by Mr. Bishop came to fruition, and so they basically extended the railroad that came to Live Oak. It went from Georgia down to Live Oak. We talked about it last month, that Live Oak to Lawton connector that was established and finished right at the end of the Civil War, that only route into Florida right after the Civil War, railroad-wise. They extended it from Live Oak down to Roland's Bluff and even beyond, later to Tampa. So it was at that point part of the Savannah, Florida and Western Railway. And so 1882 is when that was built through to what's now Branford. And actually that book, American Siberia, there's a lot of discussion talking about the building of that railroad. The convicts helped build it. And so Mr. Powell talks about that in some detail. So get the book, read it, download it, whatever. But he's talking about that railroad that is built to Branford, or what will become Branford, Roland's Bluff at the time. Branford gets a post office in 1882 in December, and or what's now Branford anyway. So some of the families that lived in that area by that point, the Ivys, Simpsons, Harpers, Dorsets, Fletchers, Martins, and Milfords. So it was starting to be more and more people living in that area. By 1885, the community had 350 citizens. That's not too bad for that era. It had an express and telegraph office, 2 schools, a Methodist church, 5 general stores, a drugstore, several saw and grist mills, and even a hotel, which was built by Mr. Ivy to accommodate steamboat passengers that were coming through. So those are some of the business, or some of the types of businesses. I've been able to find some of the names. Places like Ruff and Floyd, which was a livery stable, Rubb and Swearinger, which was general merchandise, Simpson and Roberts, which was druggists and physicians, W.M. Timmerman, who was a general merchandise seller, J.K. Ward was a blacksmith, and J.F. Wooten sold general merchandise. So lots of things going on in this community. In 1886, it's incorporated as New Branford, named after the hometown of Branford, Connecticut, of Henry Plant, one of the 2 Henrys that are so instrumental in Florida in building railroads. Henry Plant, Henry Flagler. So Henry Plant is the one building that railroad down into what's now Branford and beyond to Tampa. So Robert Ivy, who has become very prominent by this point, is good friends with Mr. Plant, and so he names the community, or renames Roland's Bluff, to New Branford after Branford, Connecticut, which is where Henry Plant was born. Sometimes it was called West Branford. There was a West Branford, and this was East Branford. There was a West Branford on the other side of the river in Lafayette County, and so it basically spanned both rivers. But eventually, the West Branford part died out, and what was left was the east part of Branford, or New Branford, aka later to be called just Branford. School records say that between 1887 and 1892, there was 1 white and 1 colored school, as they called it, in Branford. So it, again, had enough people, enough kids to have two schools during the time of segregation. After that railroad was built, it quickly became a focal point for not only railroad but also the steamboats. They would haul timber. They would haul things like goods up and down the river. They would dock at Branford. They would then transfer the stuff over to the railroad and vice versa. You can see a boxcar right here, a couple of them. Here at the depot, right here by the river. This is going to be circa 1900 or a few years later, because that's the city of Hawkinsville, and the fetus is in the background, hard to tell, but the two last steamboats to operate on the Suwannee River. That's a picture of them right there at Branford. There's also one of the largest sawmills at the time in this part of Florida anyway, was owned by Governor Drew and his family, Governor George Drew, who lived over in the Madison County side of the river. But they established sawmills in different locations, and a large one was there at Branford. And the goods that were built in Branford, the goods that were traded in Branford, would go down to the Keys. They would go to Cedar Key. They'd go down to Key West, even to New Orleans beyond. They'd also, because of the railroad being established, they would ship directly to Savannah. So you could access the East Coast a lot easier at that point. And so again, the steamboat docks and the railroad was all right there by the river, so you could very quickly and easily move stuff from one mode of transportation to the other. So, Robert Ivy, basically the founder of Branford, made a fortune in this area. He was, again, one of several brothers whose family had moved here before the Civil War to the south part of the county. When the war began, he was only barely a teenager, but he actually signed up. He somehow got in there for a little while. I think he was like 13 or 14. He became a water boy. Eventually, they found out how old he was and kicked him out. But he did serve with the local unit for a little while, a year or two, I think, before they found out how old he really was. But after the war, he and his brothers began buying up land, especially around Branford, or what became Branford, and like I've already said, established that ferry, among other things. But he was also a prolific steamboat builder, so a lot of the steamboats that ran on the river in the 1880s, 1890s, he's the one that built them. Either owned them and or built them himself. Let's see, including the C.D. Owens, he had 2 or 3 named the Suwannee, and then the Belle of Suwannee, which is probably the most famous steamboat on the river. These are all ones he either built or owned. He also built a hotel in Branford, so that could be used for the passengers, just all in one service. He could do it all. He also had the first cold storage plant in that area, and according to one record, it was the first in the state. I'm not sure about that, but that's what somebody said. And his process for curing meat was the state standard for years. Again, that's what I've read. That's second or third hand information. Take it as you will. Belle of Suwannee, this is there at Branford, close to the bluffs of Branford, perhaps what we would call Roland's Bluff 150 years ago. This is her circa 1900. A couple different stories depending on who you hear. One story is that she sank in the hurricane of 1896 that wiped out Cedar Key in this part of the state. Other sources, more reputable sources I would say, and more of them, say that she was damaged but she survived, and she sank a few years later while she was towing cedar and stuff off of the mouth of the river. 1903, I think. But regardless, Captain Ivy's the one that built the steamboat. She was famous for her honeymoon suite, and again, Branford was her main stop-off. Captain Ivy had a daughter named Bertha. She was the belle of her father's eye, so the Belle of Suwannee is named after her, indirectly. She would live in this area and continue to live in this area of Branford. She would marry a guy named F.H. George, who would become an early mayor of Branford for many, many years. So by the late 1800s, early 1900s, some of the families and citizens were A.B. Brantley was postmaster. You've got the Rayford family, the Bexley family. Dr. Pewterbaugh is there. There's a J.N. Connor, J.R. Crawford, Chester Mathis, H. Miller, M.W. Rayford. I don't know what the first names are. That's how they're listed in the records, and I hate that. But presumably the M is Matthew and H is Henry. H.W., Henry, I don't know. Yeah. Wesley, probably. I don't know. Anyway, some of the names you can probably gather, but those are some of the ones that lived here. Now then, as part of that railroad, they had to build a freight depot, and so this was the freight depot built close to the river, pretty much on the river banks, and used by the railroad for many, many years. Built, I think, somewhere around 1880, 1882, basically when that railroad came through, from the records I've been able to find. It was used by the Live Oak and Rollins Bluff Railroad, which was the one that came through, but then was a branch of the Savannah, Florida and Western. And it was used for a few years. Then they had to move it just a little bit because of the increased railroad traffic. So they moved it eastward about 100 feet to link better with the railroads that were there. And it was close by. Then in 1982, the Seaboard Coastline Railroad, which was the successor line to that one from 100 plus years before, said they needed to get rid of it. They needed to sell it, they needed to move it, they needed to do something with it. And so they sold it to the Shrine Club, the Branford Shrine Club. And it got moved, basically back to the river, close to probably where it originally was. And there it remains. It was moved about 500 feet. And the Branford Shrine Club still uses it today for meetings and other stuff. So I was there several years ago. It's pretty cool. It's not as big as our depots up here, but it is a little bit older too. So as far as I can tell, as far as somebody else's research, it's probably the last of those original depots that served on the Suwannee River, that could serve both steamboats and railroads. So anyway, that's still there today. Some of the other steamboats that were on the river in the 1880s, 1890s, some of whom were owned by Captain Ivy, C.D. Owens, and this is her in 1895 passing Peak, which was basically Lurville area. Sam Piles was another one that sailed on the river, and this is her down on Lake Panisofsky before she moved here. There's Louisa at the same place a couple slides ago, Peak. And with Peak, you've got the depot that ran right up to the river's edge also, making it easy. But that picture's from 1896. Let's see, Three States, which was one of the larger steamboats that could carry a lot more passengers. This is her in 1906, I believe, actually at Branford. So loading and unloading passengers. This is Three States in a later year, I believe, when she moved over to Apalachicola. When the 1896 hurricane hit, that devastated the region. And steamboats took a hard hit. The ones that weren't outright sunk or damaged, it basically was just no longer commercially feasible to have all these steamboats sailing up and down the river. So one by one they were sold off, or they sank, or they were just left to rot and condemned. So as those died off, other products became more prominent. Things like the timber, the livestock, tobacco, corn, watermelons, that became kind of the local staple for Branford in that area. While there's steamboats going on, I want to mention this thing here I probably have talked about before, but a shootout that was held in Branford in 1890. So pretty much, I won't say necessarily the heyday of Branford, but when it was a happening place, steamboats, you've got the railroad coming through. But there was a shootout, and there's an article that I don't have time to read all of it, but it was written by a guy named Judge May, and he lived in the area in the 1890s and that area, but he wrote it many years later as an old man. And he talks about he lived in Branford as a store clerk when this incident happened. And again, I don't have time to read it, but I will read you kind of this section here. But let me give you a preface. Basically, James Thomas, he's called different things, W.J. Lastly, J.T., yeah, James Thomas Lastly, or Lashley, lived in Branford. He apparently, from one of the records, was mayor of Branford, but we don't have those records to confirm it. But he's called the mayor in some of the period articles. So I'll take it that he was mayor at one point. He also did lots of different stuff. He was justice of the peace at the time of his murder. And so this was just a telegram received by his brother, and it says, quote, intelligence of the killing of J.T. Lastly at Branford, Florida reached us by telegraph Saturday. Mr. Lastly was a brother of Mr. L.M. Lastly of this place, and lived in this county a number of years, where many friends will regret to learn of his tragic death. Shortly after Mr. Lastly moved to Branford, he was elected mayor and during his term incurred the hostility of several scamps who made a habit of getting drunk and taking the town. That was something that happened a lot. Basically, people from Taylor County and Lafayette County would come over and get drunk and then come over to Suwannee County and cause trouble. He put a stop to such doings by lodging some of them in jail, and one J.T. Garner has had it in it for him ever since. Friday night, he succeeded in his long-form determination of killing Mr. Lasley. After the deed, he fled to an upstairs room, from which he exchanged a score of shots with Stuart Carson, a friend of Mr. Lasley and the son of Judge Carson of Crab Orchard. During the shooting, H.D. Sapp, a bystander, was instantly killed. Garner was arrested, and it was with much difficulty that he was prevented from being lynched, as Mr. Lasley was very popular in his new home. The deceased married Miss Jean Dickinson of Crab Orchard, who died in giving birth to twins, who are still living and make their home with their grandmother there. After going to Florida, he married there, and 2 children were the result of the union. Both died, however, and were buried there, and his remains were placed by their side. That was one of the records I found, and this was another one discussing basically the same thing. But there's a longer description written by that Judge May, and it's probably 10 pages of this presentation, the notes. But basically, he got drunk. Mr. Lasley, as Justice of the Peace, tried to stop him from getting kind of out of hand, and he pulled out his gun, shot him. And then when Lasley stumbled out of the bar, out of the saloon, he shot him some more, and then took off upstairs to his 2-story building that he owned. And it's when you read through it, it's kind of funny because it basically, Captain Ivy is mayor of the time, and he has to get in the middle of the street, and Garner is shooting at him but not hitting him. You've got other people back and forth shooting up and down. Kit Carson's nephew, who was the Carson mentioned in here, had moved here and was best friends with Lasley because Lasley had saved his life. And so there was a gun battle in the streets of Branford in 1890. And eventually a whole posse is formed, and they start pulling out the dynamite. They're about to blow up the whole building that Mr. Garner's in because he's the only one in there, and they say it's his building and he's not going to need it anymore anyway. So they basically pull out the dynamite and are ready to blow up the building when Captain Ivy is the mayor, Mayor Ivy at that point, basically convinces him to come down. He will not be harmed and, stand trial. So that's pretty much what happened. Interesting story. Like I said, I've got it right here, just all kinds of several pages worth. But where the Garner building was, pretty much where this incident happened, was where the Branford Feed Store, that picture there, was taken. Lot 11, Block 2 in Branford. So that's the recent building of where the Garner building was. So it was kind of a Wild West. We've talked about gunfights in Live Oak also, but this one was a big one in 1890 that involved the whole town. People like Captain Ivy and others prospered during this time until that hurricane of 1896 hit. And it was bad. And I've talked about it, I believe, before, but Cedar Key, basically, the location of Cedar Key today is not where Cedar Key was prior to 1896. They moved the entire town from one island to another island because of the devastation that was wrought by the hurricane of 1896. They didn't name them back then. It was just the hurricane of that year. That was the bad one. But not only was Cedar Key hit hard, but this whole area, it was kind of like what we suffered last year with Idalia. Lots of trees down. Pretty much about every building in Branford was blown down. All the trees in the surrounding area pretty much were blown down, or at least damaged. And there was a resident who lived here as a young girl. Her name was, when she was married, was Miss Lula Martin. And so she wrote years later about her reminiscences. And she said basically it was about impossible to get around anywhere in that area because of all the trees. So you only had to go by foot. You couldn't mule or horse, anything like that. You had to go by foot because of all the trees that were uprooted and broken. Much of the old hard pine timber was destroyed. She remembered an old farm building, which is where the Baptist church was meeting. They had to pretty much prop it up because it was almost falling over, but not quite. But it was only one of the only buildings left. And so the Baptist church used it, the Presbyterians used it, and so did the Methodists. So pretty much everybody was using the 2 or 3 buildings that really had survived. And so that was one of them. So Branford started rebuilding. So by the late 1800s, early 1900s, they had places like the Stalvey Hotel, which at one point I believe had been the Ivy Hotel. They had the Masonic Temple, Captain Ivy's store, Noah Green's store, Dr. Mann's drugstore, Wilkerson Library Stables, Dr. Peter Bob's drugstore, and the sawmill that was originally operated by the Drew family, but then sold. This may or may not be that sawmill, but that was a sawmill in the Branford area circa 1870. By the early 1900s, Suwannee County, including the Branford area, is producing either 10% of the U.S. supply or 10% of the world supply of Sea Island cotton, which is a short staple fine type of cotton. And Suwannee County is producing a whole lot of it. And so that would have been the Branford area as well. Florida's first steel railway bridge was either built or more likely installed by Governor Drew and his family to run the Suwannee and San Pedro Railroad, which later became part of Florida Railway. And that was put in the early 1900s. And I think I've talked about this before. I know in a presentation whether I've done it here or somewhere else. But there's indications it was actually built probably in the 1870s based on the stampings inside of it. But it was moved at least to Suwannee County in about 1900 to be used as the bridge for Florida Railway, what became the Florida Railway. After about 20 years, the Florida Railway ceased operations, and the state and the counties just turned it up and down river so the steamboats could continue to go. And there it sits still today. Still there. Still there. So that's a picture basically 100 years apart. I think I took that one when my son and I went there to just look at it. So still down there. It's upriver from Branford, but in that same general vicinity. So in 1909, the same year that picture was made, Branford either formed or more likely reformed as a community, as a municipal corporation, as a town, so to speak. H.J. Heath was elected the mayor. R.E. Kemp, F.H. George, A.H. Key, D.H. Taylor, and H.B. Blunt were elected aldermen. John Houghton was the clerk and assessor. W.H. Stevens was the treasurer. And S.P. Blunt was the marshal and tax collector. So basically it sounds like they had stopped having a town, and they reformed it, which happens sometimes. This was not the only bridge in the early 1900s. We also had the first of several vehicle bridges, more horse and buggy then. But this was the Branford Bridge that was built in 1907. It was built the same year as a bridge in Louisville was built, and by the same company, the Converse Bridge Company. And this is part of the first generation of vehicle bridges in Suwannee County. And I've talked about them before, and probably we'll talk about them more at length. But this bridge was built while we still had steamboats. And so if you look carefully, it's hard to tell, but this is the center pylon, and it looks like it also revolves like this one. So this part would turn so you could steamboats up and down river. And these parts were stationary. So it was built in 1907. The ironic thing is they spent all this money for this thing, and within a few years steamboats stopped selling on the river. So they could have waited 5-10 more years and paid a whole lot less for a lot cheaper bridge. But this was a photo of it taken in 1925. So that was the first Branford vehicle bridge, and/or horse and buggy bridge early on. This is an insurance map of Branford in 1912. So you can see sawmill operations and such down here. The river is here, and various houses. Yellow means they're wooden. So pretty much everything in Branford was wooden, except for you've got a couple of tin is the blue and brick is the red. So most of Branford, like most places, was a lot of wood in the early 1900s, late 1800s. Branford State Bank was organized in 1910. In 1918, the Branford Lumber Mill was sold to the Dowling family, or back to them technically. It included the sawmill, the commissary, the lumber, the railway, and the rolling stock. And the Dowling family, which Governor down. Governor Drew had one previously, sorry. The Dowlings, Thomas Dowling and his relatives, which Mr. Dowling had already died, Thomas Dowling, but he had several relatives, brothers, and nephews and such that continued the operations. But the Dowling family only owned that for about 2 years, then they sold it off to another one. It was the primary source of income for the community at that point, so it was a big deal that they kept it running because that helped Branford to survive. There's a 1915 editorial in the Suwannee Democrat, and it basically was referencing an article in the Suwannee Herald, which was the newspaper that was run in Branford at the time, and it talks about, quote, where Branford expresses the belief that Branford will be the capital of Florida within 10 years and the metropolis of the South. We had finally hoped to see the capital located at Live Oak, but if Branford is going to grab it, we give it up. That Branford town is a good live one. It wants only the best and goes after what it wants, and there seems no chance to beat it in the race. We give up, brother. We'll be content to have the capital at Branford just so it comes to Suwannee County where it belongs. Obviously, it's not here. Probably a good thing because that's what we would look like. Probably for the best, I would say. Some people might argue with me, but again, all that flooding and stuff probably wouldn't have gone well with state capitol underwater. In 1920, they have another school established in Branford to be as a junior high school. They also closed the Dempsey and Hall School, and part of that building was moved to Branford. Yeah, 1921, Branford's population had doubled in 10 years. So a lot of people were moving there. Lots of good things. They got electricity, it looks like, in 1921, so yay for them. That's about 25 years after Live Oak got it. But that was pretty much the next place in Suwannee County to get electricity. In 1922, though, they had a bad year. In May of that year, their big sawmills burned down. They even called in Live Oak Fire Department to come help, but it was just too little too late. So the pumping station, the mill, all the hoses were useless. It was all burned down pretty much. Even formed a bucket brigade from the river to try to use water to put it out. And they saved most of Branford, but they had damage to the lumber mill, the planing mill, power station were all destroyed. And a lot of businesses were paralyzed because that lumber mill was the main source of employment. So the people couldn't get paid, they couldn't buy stuff. So all of Branford was affected. And then a couple months later, okay, that was a sawmill and related structures. They had saved the downtown business district. A couple months later, the business block on the west side of Suwannee Avenue burned. So pretty much half of what was left burned down a couple months later. Destroyed, let's see, it started in the store of Owens and Dorset. It destroyed Ware's Pharmacy, the building owned by Noah Green, the Golden Dry Goods Company, the J. Lipsey Stock and Building, Owen and Dorset Building and Stock, and 3 stores that were owned by Mr. Kelly. Most of those were either uninsured or underinsured, so that was a big hit also. Then within a couple weeks, another fire. They lost Bailey's Drugstore and Landrum's Garage. So 3 fires in Branford in 1922. That was bad. Lots of fires going on. But again, look at what we're dealing with. Lots of wood. And these buildings, by this point, many of them were 30 or 40 years old, so easier to light and burn. So Branford rebuilds. In the process of rebuilding in 1926, they award a contract to S.A. Heinley for a new Branford school. So this is what is built to replace the former school, former basically high school. And this was 2-story brick, as you can see. The school before that had been an old frame home, and also the old Masonic Hall had served as that. So lots of different things. So they're rebuilding, and more brick this time. Good for them. By the 1930s, Branford had paved roads. They had electricity again. They had a city water supply. They had good schools. They had a strong bank, a large cold storage plant. They had livestock markets, turkey markets, tobacco markets. So lots of markets. I've got many years ago, probably in the late 90s, two longtime Branford residents. One of them was Bill Ware. The other one was Leon Hatch. They wrote basically, I guess you could say, reminiscences of their time as kids in Branford. And there's a whole lot of details I don't have time to get into today. Yeah, definitely not into today. That they're talking about, but it's just interesting trying to figure out where places were. And if you'll see on this map, it's not on there. On my version of the map, I've got lots of little pop-outs where I was plotting. I've been plotting where all those places were based on their descriptions. You know, go down this street and starting at this block and whatnot. So it's been very helpful. But lots of different things. They talked about the free roam era. So if you walked around, you had to watch out for the cows and the hogs because they were just roaming out in the wild. He talks about the bridge that was built, which was a newer bridge than the one I showed you. They like to skate on it, and some of them like to jump off of it to the river. Lots of different buildings. Their power, they had electricity, and it was owned by M.A. Best, but the electricity of the entire town was shut off at midnight, and then it restarted at 6 a.m. So hope your reading is done and your cooking and whatever else you wanted to do for the night that involved electricity, because you were done at midnight whether you wanted to be or not. Yeah, lots of different records I don't have time to get into, but this is, that was still one of the major hotels, the Stalvey Hotel, originally the Ivy Hotel, also called the Branford Hotel, lots of different names over the years. This is that new bridge that they like to jump off of and skate on. 1933 is when it was authorized, completed at the very end of 1934. It cost $100,000. Which, I mean, you know, that was a lot of money back then. Not so much today. But it replaced that turning room, which had been built about 15, 20 years before. 1934, Branford suffers another fire. This one knocks out all the lights and the water because it knocks out the power plant. All those related buildings burned to the ground. So Mr. Best owned them, and they were operated by Florida Power. All that was lost. So Branford again had no electricity for a little while, but they rebuilt and carried on. Same year, they had additional classrooms added to that school, so that was good. Come on. All right, there we go. This is what I'm talking about. My map I've got at the office, and I posted it here. See all these little things? That's where I've got information referenced by these two guys, Mr. Hatch and Mr. Ware, of descriptions, books and pages and all that kind of stuff. So it's very helpful for me to be able to look up stuff. But one of the things, this is a picture from 1943 showing them, by the way. There's a picture of the school, which would have been, these are cutouts, they're over here somewhere, but that was the school. But you see, it's hard to tell, but the dark are brick. So there's still some wooden places, but a lot more brick in downtown Branford. They learned their lesson finally. 1945, World War II has just ended, and we've got a race-related murder that happens down in the Branford area. And basically what happens in September, a guy named Tom Cruise, he was the constable of Suwannee County. He was also the town marshal of Branford. He takes Army veteran Sam McFadden, a black man, into custody. There's some retaliation, it looks like, based upon what Mr. Cruz says was disrespect. So he whipped McFadden and then forced him to jump at gunpoint in the Suwannee River. McFadden couldn't swim, he drowned. That probably would have been the end of it, except the body floated up, got caught in some trees downriver and floated up. And so Mr. Cruz they were trying to put him to trial, but nobody would convict him. Grand jury and all that kind of stuff, they refused to indict him. The federal courts eventually got involved, and they were able to fine him $1,000 because he violated Mr. McFadden's civil rights. That's the best they could do under the laws of the time. So not good, not good. But that did happen in the Branford area. A couple years later, 1947, a new Branford jail was constructed of cement blocks, exactly where the old jail in Branford had been. The records show it had 4 cells. Let's see. Branford flooding. This is Dowling Park, by the way, not Branford, but it's indicative of what Branford would have looked like. Several floods, 1928, 1948, 1964 especially. Branford got hit hard. Lots of places were flooded. In some places along the river was 6 miles wide. That's how much flooding was involved. And again, this is Dowling Park. That's the Dowling Park Depot. That's the bridge where they have put boxcars over so the bridge would not be washed away. Branford looked pretty much like this too. Flooding. But the waters receded. Branford continued. In 1949 and 1950, there were more additions to the schools, like gymnasiums, and a cafeteria, because up until that point, most of the kids either went home for lunch or they brought their own bag of lunch. But after the war, there was a lot of expansion of education and a lot more money going into education. So they started building things like cafeterias, band rooms, modern heating plants, those kinds of things. Now, Branford Springs, that used to be 2 springs that were close by. In 1950, they caved in basically, and they ceased flowing. So in 1951, the county commission appropriated funding to basically redo it, to make it flow again. And so they wanted to develop it as a park. So they started working on it. The engineers from Gainesville determined that they could actually make it flow again at full force. So they started working on it, and as part of the project, they basically moved dirt to make 1 spring out of the 2 that had been there, and then to make it flow down river, or back into the river again. Basically renewing the flow of the river, the flow of the springs of the river. 1954, they dedicated the park as Robert A. Ivy Memorial Park, and acting Governor Charlie Johns was there for the dedication ceremonies. He was acting governor because Governor McCarty had died the year before. Of course, that still operates today as Ivy Memorial Park with springs. Branford in the 1950s, several improvements. They got a new water system. They got a new water treatment plant, so that was good for them. One source says Branford was the first town in North Florida to have dial telephone service installed. They said it's true, I don't know, but we'll take it as what they said. In 1951, they revised Branford's charter as a town, did some revisions to it. They still had the 2 schools. Actually, they had 3, because they had Branford Elementary, Branford High School, and then the what was called the Negro School. They added more rooms to the elementary school in that year. 1956, Branford had another fire. They lost their largest employer again. This time it was the Suwannee Pole and Piling Company sawmill, which had been in operation for 10 years. They lost that, so there was another hit to Branford. They also lost in the 50s, they lost the Ivy Hotel to fire. So the one I showed you a couple slides ago, that one burned down. One of the places that was still left was Ware's Pharmacy, which is a photo there from the 1950s. I believe that's Mr. Ware there on the right. In 1956, Branford opens a library, a branch of the Suwannee River Regional Library System. And for many, many years in Branford, Friday nights was like everybody come to town. Everybody would come to town. They would have movie nights, social nights. All the shops would open or stay open until about midnight. So lots of stuff going on Friday nights. So the residents could come, they could mingle. This is a picture from 1958 showing downtown Branford. So I mean, lots of people showing up. There's one of the pictures of Ivy Park in 1960. According to a 1959 article, it was the first location in Suwannee County that had a major boat ramp built, so the public could use it. So that's the new boat ramp in 1960 in use. Here's a picture from 1960 showing downtown Branford. Again, lots of brick buildings to replace those first and second generation ones. In 1960, Branford lost one of its oldest structures. The old Masonic Lodge was torn down. It was old, had been there for a long time. It was just time to replace it. So they tore it down, and that was the one that had been used as a school. It also served as town hall at one point too, and a voting place. Same year they built the new Branford State Bank, which is up there on the top, and a new post office at the bottom. And they also had the Branford Boat Works was constructed, and that was building boats for the area to go on the river. So that was an employer there. 1962, they add even more to the Branford High School, like a library. But then a few years later, they decided to tear it down. Now, that's 1964 at this point. Hurricane Dora has just hit Suwannee County. It's pretty much ruined several of the Live Oak schools, and the state and the federal government appropriate a lot of money for us to rebuild a lot of schools. And so Suwannee County takes advantage of that, rebuilding or building new schools in Live Oak, but also down in Branford. So they decided to do that. Construction begins on 11 classrooms, plus labs and some other things. And it's built in the old Branford High School, that brick building I showed you a little while ago. That one was torn down. Modern Branford, the last 50 years, lots of improvements. Still has a small town atmosphere. They've got more businesses than they used to. 1982, they get a new kindergarten building, and it was named the Shirley A. Fletcher Memorial Kindergarten. Since that time, they've had a new town hall, fire station, new library, and additions to the schools. Branford, the old Branford State Bank that was established in 1910, was bought out by Capital City Bank. You've got Lafayette State Bank moving into Branford. Later it comes up to Live Oak. You've got this library built in Branford, 1999, named after former long-term Sheriff Robert Leonard building. Also, a new post office built in Branford. That's the newer elementary school picture. And so today, Branford's still called the spring diving capital of the world. Lots of people come to not only Branford Springs, but the springs around Suwannee County, obviously, to come use the waters. Thousands of tourists. So, Branford's still pretty small. It also has the Greenway Trail, which is where the old rail line used to go through, and that goes through Branford all the way. They're moving it slowly, but surely, maybe northward to Live Oak. So lots of different places. So, not too bad, only a few minutes late. Branford. Next month, Lord willing, creek don't rise, Dowling Park. Any questions, comments, thoughts? Appreciate it.
Very much.
Thank y'all for coming. Appreciate it. Hope y'all had a good 4th. And Lord willing, see y'all next month, August, right? Yeah, August.
I'm heading